Other zoning questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I had one actually on the cell tower on Article 10. Because I've been to a couple of town meetings where cell towers have come up and been proposed and shot down in flames. And, you know, I think that one thing I'm curious about Article 10 is it intended to address some of the defects in presentation that have resulted in defeat of those proposals. And the follow-up question is there any intent to have like a strategic plan for communication towers in the town so that people can have a better general understanding of like what's there now, what is the coverage, do we need more, you know, in order to have good coverage for emergency services, that kind of thing, so that people are operating from a solid base of information?
Short answer. The only time the cell tower went to town meeting, in my 2-year tenure anyway, had nothing to do with the cell tower. The cell tower that was discussed at 2016 town meeting was actually a warrant article for the selectmen to be able to have the authorization to sign a lease for real property greater than 5 years. So most cell towers want to be somewhere for 20 years. The selectmen could have said, yes, we think it's fine, but it's actually up to town meeting to decide if the town can lease property. So there were actually a number of things discussed at town meeting about cell towers that the planning board can never bring up. You can't bring up health impacts, you can't bring up radiation schemes, you can't bring up any of that in the planning board level. That's according to the feds. That's not something we made up and voted on. So part of the answer is yes. Some of the concerns that were brought up at town meeting dealt with height, location, how many, what's it look like. The changes that are in here, I'm sorry, it's only 20-some pages. Part of it's federal. As I over paraphrased perhaps before, the intent now is to say, okay, so you want one of these in our town. You have to prove that this proposal that you have cannot be done with a shorter tower, multiple towers, several locations, etc. It also reduced the height of the towers, which is an element of local control. So it went, currently towers are allowed to go to 150 feet in height, and this proposal knocks it down to 100 feet in the commercial and 80 feet in the residential zone, which is 90% of the town. Now, does that mean that no tower will ever be greater than 100 feet? No, towers can still exceed 100 feet, but they have a higher bar to achieve to do that. And they also have the ability to go back to the FCC and say, this isn't tall enough, we want our 20% increase, and the FCC says, yes, please have that. So the planning board's general consensus, to paraphrase them, was to say, let's hold them at 100. If they go up to 120, so be it. It's still less than the 150 starting point that they have currently. Make sense?
It makes sense in the specifics, but
The other part of your question is almost impossible. In reviewing the last tower that was proposed at 58 Portsmouth Avenue, the planning board engaged a radio frequency engineer. If you think zoning would put you to sleep, try radio frequency engineering. The trick with that is that the information the applicant provides shows their coverage, if you will. You know, the green blob that we all use to pick which carrier to use. That's only what they want to share, that's not the real information. I mean, the actual hard data is much different than that cloud they show the planning board. What is impossible to know is, well, what's Verizon's real cloud? What's AT&T's real cloud? What's T-Mobile? You know, pick a carrier. They all have their bubbles. You cannot get that information. So the planning board, in fact, Mike Houghton said, why don't we just come up with a master plan? We want a tower here, 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 and here. That's it. We don't know. And the FCC says, demonstrate a need, you get a tower. It's really, I mean, they have a much longer ordinance, but it basically says that. So as long as they can demonstrate a need, they can get a tower. And then it's planning board's hope, my hope, this actually puts some more teeth back in Stratham to prove that out.
Yeah, I think I heard you said, when, his question about that got voted out with the tower, you were saying that was, the way that warrant was written was only for allowing, how did it ever end up on that hill?
That's town property. The
Okay,
top of that hill is town property, and I'm stepping a bit out, so if I need, bring me back in. The town purchased the property on the hill for the water tank to go with the water and sewer project.
Right,
et cetera.
right.
So had the water and sewer project gone more quickly than it has, theoretically, the water tank would be on top of the hill, and Verizon would simply put a tower on the water tank, and no one would be the wiser, if you will. It may or may not still have required the
Okay.
lease.
But the warrant then, because everyone was focusing on that hill.
The towers are
and the
gonna kill
tower,
people,
which you
yeah.
just said,
Yeah.
kind of blew my
Yeah.
mind that we weren't talking about a tower on the hill.
No,
when we were voting.
it was a 90-foot monopine on the hill.
Yeah, it was on, at Dave Foss's house.
Yeah, next to it, yeah.
So
Not
the
by
communication, not understanding that warrant, I think a lot of people, if it was just a vote to allow the selectmen to go off and decide or make a recommendation.
No, in fact, that tower, that 90-foot monopine has actually received all of the requisite variances and planning board approvals to go on that spot.
And I think the public,
Provided there was a lease.
the
on
town
ground.
was voting on a tower on that spot.
Correct.
So communication,
I'll come back every year.
okay, but that's,
Right,
that
we
was.
have that on tape. Digital stuff.
Our intent is making it harder for the cell phone companies to get cell towers in Stratham, and giving more power to the residents and the Board of Selectmen,
To the planning board,
to the planning board,
not the selectmen,
and not the residents.
not the, well, the residents by extension of the planning board. There's
Okay.
still gonna be a public hearing and all of that.
Right, okay.
If you look specifically, all of you, please turn to page 45 in the town report. They have a series of steps to prove that they can or cannot co-locate on existing facilities. They then have to go on page 47 through 3 pages of siting standards to put in a tower. So one of the big sentences now, in all applications for construction of a new tower or substantial modification of an existing tower, the applicant must prove by substantial evidence, including but not limited to a town-wide site evaluation plan for coverage that details possible antenna or co-location options which contemplate a 5-year development horizon, that a bona fide need exists for the tower or a substantial modification, and that no reasonable combination of locations, techniques, or technologies will satisfy the need. There's part of your answer.
Yeah.
Well, if I may comment, I mean, first of all, there are information sources available like Open Signal that actually make use of all of us to provide information to actually show the coverage map of an area. And secondly, this is not a very big market, Stratham. Most of the carriers don't really care that much about us, I don't think. So the idea that they're going to put that huge amount of effort into meeting those standards is optimistic. So I think
It's almost a deterrent in and of itself.
right. So if we want, I think that we have to understand that if we want, these kinds of infrastructure projects, if we want these kinds of facilities and telecommunication capabilities, we have to do something to encourage them, rather than.
Well, okay, now I hear where you're going. All right, so 19.5, for those that want to figure out how much more difficult it will be to put in a new tower. You have to understand that this is a new tower. The prior section, 19.4.2, for all those taking notes, are all the things the town can't touch. So if you want to put an antenna on the church on Emery Lane, that's fine. The town cannot regulate antennas. So a lot of the discussion that came up with 57 Portsmouth Avenue and 58 Portsmouth Avenue was, why don't you put a whole bunch of those small cell antennas all over the place? Well, if that's what they're doing, federal law and the state statute says you can't touch it anyway, town. So if you do the small cell, you don't have to go to the planning board. So not only is it encouraging or incentivizing the small antenna arrays on buildings, on steeples, I'd say tall buildings, but there aren't many. That's encouraged. So what is discouraged and what becomes very difficult is putting in the 130-foot poles, or the varsity wireless that's 170 down behind Stratham Stone. Now, if you call out where all of the different towers are, many of you probably don't even recognize they're there anymore because you don't see them.
Yeah, this is a quick
Yes.
question. Back to the leasing thing. With these changes, I understand how it's going to work, or I understand as well as I'm going to understand the incentives and disincentives there. I don't remember which way that vote went at town meeting. Do the selectmen, they cannot sign, right now they cannot enter into a lease of a longer term than 5 years without town meeting, a town meeting vote.
Which is,
That's for any.
that's for anything, yeah. That's what pushed Verizon in this instance to look at 157 Portsmouth, and everyone said, not there. And Verizon said, well, you didn't want it on town land here, you didn't want it on town land here, so we have to look at private property. Who's willing to have a tower, and people started cropping up. So ultimately, they landed on 58.
Okay. We take a break from zoning?